Inicialmente quiero expresar mis agradecimientos a Dr. Beltrán y todos por la invitación de estar aquí. Today we're going to talk about calcium, phosphorus, and vitamin D. La siguiente, por favor. We'll talk a little bit about the problems of hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia, the problem of bone loss, osteopenia, and rickets, racketismo of prematurity, vitamin D in premature infants, and a little bit about post-discharge issues related to the bone minerals. Well, let's start with the problem of hypocalcemia, or low serum calcium. There really are no clear absolute definitions. The traditional definitions have been somewhat based on birth weight. Babies who are full-term, babies who are relatively large, we've usually used a lower limit of normal of 8 milligrams per deciliter, or about 2 millimolar. For those who have the ability to measure ionized calcium, which is preferred, a lower limit of about 1.1 millimolar. In general, there are not too many clinical symptoms that babies will have, less than about 0.95 to 1.0 millimolar. For reasons that are not entirely clear, very low birth weight infants tend to tolerate a slightly lower level of calcium in their blood. In the traditional definition, all right. For very low birth weight infants, an ionized calcium less than 1.0 millimolar is a traditional definition. For practical purposes, it's very hard to find a very low birth weight infant that has much of the way of symptoms from hypocalcemia. We typically will use a value of about 0.8 millimolar, but the reality is that it's very uncommon to have a small baby that actually has any observable symptoms from hypocalcemia. So it seems to be a problem that's somewhat more theoretical than real. La siguiente. What causes hypocalcemia in the first couple of days? Well, it depends upon the babies. And actually, there's been very, very little research done on this topic in the last 20 to 30 years. Most of the research is quite old. For premature infants, it appears that their parathyroid hormone function is somewhat diminished, even though their levels of parathyroid hormone are not necessarily low, and that can be part of the problem, although, again, there's not much research. Infants of diabetic mother are commonly hypocalcemic. The mechanism is unknown. It may be related to excess calcitonin and inadequate parathyroid hormone function. One that we see a lot is what we might call cardiorespiratory depression at birth, which is the current name for birth asphyxia. And that's probably related to the breakdown and destruction of tissue with release of phosphate, and the relative increase in phosphate drives down the calcium and leads to hypocalcemia. Intrauterine growth retardation is associated with decreased transplacental calcium transfer. In reality, hypocalcemia is not very common in this setting. It can occur, but it's not that common. There's been a lot of interest in the topic of what mothers who are given magnesium sulfate therapy due to preeclampsia or to prevent premature delivery. In reality, that doesn't cause much problems for mothers who've been on magnesium sulfate for a very long period of time. They can lose bone mineral. They can become hypocalcemic. It's actually an extremely uncommon problem. And less common nowadays, because we don't do them as much, at least in the United States, are artificially hyperventilating babies for pulmonary hypertension or the use of exchange transfusions. Okay, la siguiente. Therapy for early hypocalcemia. Well, our therapy of choice for early hypocalcemia is to give the babies TPN as soon as possible. We don't routinely start babies on intravenous dextrose with calcium added. Most babies don't need that. So we try to get babies on TPN in the first day of life, in which we give them protein and calcium, but we leave the phosphorus out of the TPN. One of the interesting questions we've had about first day of life TPN is whether or not you should include magnesium in the TPN, because a lot of the mothers have been on magnesium therapy. See. Okay. A lot of the mothers have been on magnesium therapy. And in general, we've gone ahead and continued the magnesium in the TPN for the first day of life, because it's fairly hard for most of those babies to become magnesium toxic. one of the things that we have are cardiologists and a lot of people that are using calcium given intravenously to support cardiac function. And one of the things that we've tried to do is note that if you give calcium in TPN at reasonable levels, you can actually give a whole circulating volume of calcium in about 4 to 6 hours. And you don't need to start a second intravenous calcium infusion. So we've tried to discourage people from running secondary calcium infusions in babies because it causes a lot of damage to tissues. If you're running your TPN via umbilical venous catheter, via percutaneous line, that really provides enough calcium for almost any baby. Symptomatic hypocalcemia, which is uncommon but does occur, is a medical problem, not a nutritional problem, and should be treated as a medical problem through the use of calcium gluconate or calcium chloride given intravenously. Now, a problem with many babies who are symptomatic with hypocalcemia is that they're also hypomagnesemic. The serum magnesium is low. And we've increasingly recognized this as a clinical problem. Hypomagnesemia depresses your parathyroid hormone function. So therefore, babies who are hypocalcemic and also hypomagnesemic may not respond to calcium very well unless you also give them therapy with magnesium. And the doses of magnesium sulfate needed are there. Usually we give 25 milligrams per kilogram per dose, which is 0.2 milliequivalents per kilo per dose. It can be given every 12 hours, given intravenously, usually over 2 hours. Sometimes you can give it over an hour. It's fairly safe and really quite effective. There is an entity which I'm not sure you see too much of here, but we see occasionally, called late hypocalcemia. These are babies who are otherwise healthy, who come home and then come back in the hospital or present otherwise about 4 to 7 days with seizures. And when they're evaluated, they're found to have a very low serum calcium, a very high serum phosphorus, and they're seizing. This usually occurs in ionized calcium at about 0.7 to 0.9, 0.95. The usual cause is an intake of phosphorus that's greater than what the infant can utilize. It was originally described in the 1940s and 50s in babies who were receiving whole cow's milk before infant formulas were widely used. It's not commonly seen anymore. For reasons we don't understand, it's seen a lot more in Texas than it is in other parts of the United States. We have some ideas why that might be, but I'm not sure. The nice thing is it's never ever been reported in an exclusively breastfed baby. And that's because breast milk is a very low phosphorus source. The quantity of phosphorus in human milk is less than that in any infant formula that exists anywhere because that's the way the law works. And so it's almost impossible to get phosphorus overload in a breastfed baby. Next. Siguiente. This gives you some idea of what the phosphorus levels are. I want you to focus for the moment primarily on the phosphorus level on the right-hand column. So you see human milk has about 14-15 milligrams per deciliter of phosphorus. Cow's milk has 95. Goat's milk is very high, which is one of the reasons why goat's milk is not ideal for use in the early phase of life for babies. It has very high phosphorus level. The cow milk-based formula, the standard formulas, have about twice the amount of phosphorus in them as human milk does. And then the preterm formulas, the transitional formulas, which are the post-discharge formulas, are all fairly high. The lowest existing mineral-containing formula in the United States is actually a medical formula. It's not a routine formula, and I don't know if it's sold here, called PM6040, which is used for renal failure babies. So it's not even a routine formula. Therapy for late hypocalcemia, as for that matter for any symptomatic hypocalcemia, is high-dose infusions of calcium. Again, one can cause tremendous problems with skin damage from high-dose calcium infusion. So generally we prefer to have central access via umbilical catheter or a percutaneous line or other sort of line if we need to give high-dose calcium. These respond to low calcium, low phosphorus formula if breastfeeding or breast milk is not available, with supplemental calcium given. There's a controversy about whether or not activated vitamin D, 125 dihydroxyvitamin D, which is also known as calcitriol, it's marketed in the United States as Rocaltrol, is beneficial to increase calcium absorption and help resolve the issue. And it doesn't usually have long-term sequelae. It's actually one of the most least long-term problems, least sequelae-associated causes of early seizure disorder. La siguiente. Hypercalcemia. As pediatricians and neonatologists, hypercalcemia isn't usually a problem for us, or if it is, we've mostly ignored it. But we're starting to see more of it, and I'll explain a little bit why. It's relatively common to have mild hypercalcemia, 11 to 12 milligrams per deciliter, 1.4 to 1.6 millimolar when ionized calcium is measured. It was described a number of years ago as being associated with some hyperabsorption of calcium. That probably